Right before Jesus handed humanity the most repeated prayer in human history, the Lord's Prayer, he stopped. He didn't start with gentle encouragement. He cleared the ground first with a stinging warning. He called some of the most common prayer habits by their plain, unfiltered names: vain, empty, hypocritical. Think about that for a second. Why clear the ground first? Because the most famous prayer ever spoken can't actually land in your life until three specific habits are pulled out by the root. This is not a video about praying longer, more often, or using fancier words. This is about what Jesus explicitly condemned as worthless, and exactly what he told you to do instead. Let's look at the prayer habits Jesus called vain and what to do instead. Jesus is standing in front of one of the largest crowds he will ever teach, in the middle of the most famous sermon he will ever give, and right before he hands them the most repeated prayer in human history, he stops to tell them what not to do first. Not gently, not as a footnote. He calls it, in plain language, vain, empty, hypocritical. Think about that sequence for a second. He doesn't just launch straight into the Lord's Prayer. He clears the ground first, as if the most famous prayer ever spoken can't actually land in your life until three specific habits are pulled out by the root. This is not a list of prayer tips. This is not about praying more or longer or in fancier words. This is not a technique you can add to what you're already doing. This is what Jesus called vain, worthless, and hypocritical in his own recorded words, and exactly what he told you to do instead of each one. Let's start with the first habit, because Jesus names it before he names anything else. When you pray, he says, you shall not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen by men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. The Greek word behind hypocrite here is hypokrites, originally the word for a stage actor, someone performing behind a mask, saying lines written for an audience rather than words that are actually true of them. You have to picture what this actually looked like in that world. There were fixed hours for daily prayer, morning, afternoon, evening, and if you wanted an audience, all you had to do was make sure you were standing visibly in the synagogue or on a busy street corner at exactly those hours. Not praying in secret and getting noticed by accident. Positioning yourself on purpose, timed perfectly, so the maximum number of people would see you doing it. And Jesus says something almost devastating about people who do this. They have their reward. Present tense, already paid in full. The applause they wanted, they already received. There's nothing left for God to add, because the transaction was never with God in the first place. There's an older echo of this exact accusation, centuries before Jesus, spoken through the prophet Isaiah. These people draw near me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Outward performance, inward absence. Jesus isn't inventing a new complaint. He's naming a pattern God had already flagged long before and pointing out that it was still alive and well in front of him. Here's the alternative Jesus gives immediately in the very next verse. But you, when you pray, go into your room, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. The Greek word for room here is timaion, not a grand space, but a small inner storeroom, the most hidden, unremarkable room in an ordinary house. Jesus isn't telling you to never pray with other people. He's telling you to build the habit somewhere no audience can see it at all, so you find out what your prayer actually sounds like when nobody's watching. There's a striking Old Testament example of exactly this instinct, and it comes from a man in one of the most public, dangerous positions imaginable. Daniel, serving in the Persian government under a king's decree forbidding prayer to anyone but the king himself, doesn't stop praying and doesn't suddenly start praying loudly to prove a political point either. Scripture says he goes to his upper room, and with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he kneels down 3 times a day and prays, just as he had done before. His enemies don't catch him performing for a crowd. They catch him doing, in private, exactly what he'd always done. And that consistency is what gets him thrown into the lion's den. The habit was never for show. That's precisely why it survived the danger. Before we go further, here's where we are. 1 habit down, performance praying, done for an audience. 2 more to go, and the next one has nothing to do with who's watching. It's about the words themselves. The second habit Jesus names is this: and when you pray, Do not use vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. The Greek word here is batalogeo, a word so rare it's used exactly once in the entire New Testament, likely meaning to babble, to stammer out syllables that don't actually mean anything, empty sound piled on empty sound. In that world, this was a real, common religious practice. Pagan worshippers would repeat a god's name over and over, or recite a fixed formula again and again, on the assumption that sheer volume of words was what finally got a deity's attention. Say it enough times, long enough, loud enough, and eventually you'd wear down the silence. There's actually a vivid Old Testament picture of exactly this kind of repetition, centuries before Jesus ever said the word batalogeo. On Mount Carmel, the prophets of Baal try to call fire down from their God, and they don't just ask once. Scripture says they cried out and cut themselves, according to their custom, with knives and lances until the blood gushed out on them, calling on the name of Baal from morning until noon, and on until the time of the evening sacrifice. Hours of repeated, escalating, increasingly desperate noise, and nothing happens. No voice, no fire, no answer at all. That entire scene is the picture Jesus has in mind when he warns against many words, volume and repetition mistaken for a substitute for being heard. And Jesus tells his disciples plainly, "Do not be like them, for your Father knows the things you have need of before you ask him." Here's what that actually exposes. If repetition worked because it informed God of something he didn't already know, that would be one thing. But Jesus says the Father already knows, which means repeating the same worn phrase over and over, hoping the volume itself accomplishes something, was never actually about communication in the first place. It was about the same instinct as the pagan incantations, treating prayer like a formula to be correctly repeated rather than a relationship to be honestly lived in. And notice what Jesus does immediately after naming this. He doesn't just say, "Don't babble and move on." He hands his disciples the exact opposite, right there in the same breath, the Lord's Prayer. Count the words. It is short. It is direct. Every line does something specific. It isn't padded. It isn't repeated for effect. It isn't longer than it needs to be. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. 9 short lines, each one carrying its own specific weight. Worship, submission, dependence, confession, protection, with nothing wasted and nothing repeated for effect. The most famous prayer in human history is structurally the precise opposite of babbling. Now, the third habit, and this one might be the hardest to see in yourself because it usually wears the costume of humility while doing the opposite underneath. Jesus tells a story about 2 men who go up to the temple to pray. One is a Pharisee, a respected religious leader, and he stands and prays like this: "God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess." Read that prayer again and notice what it's actually doing. Every single sentence is a comparison. Not one line is actually about God. It's a resume, addressed to heaven, but written for an audience, even if the only audience left in the room is himself. The other man is a tax collector, a despised collaborator with Rome in that culture. He stands at a distance. He won't even lift his eyes toward heaven. He beats his chest and prays exactly this: "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." And Jesus says plainly, "I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be abased, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." Here's what most people miss about this third habit, and it's the part that makes it more than a lesson in etiquette. In another passage, Jesus warns about scribes, religious teachers, who love to walk around in long robes, love greetings in the marketplace, and for a pretense, make long prayers. And then he says something chilling right in the same sentence: "These devour widows' houses." Think about what that connection actually means. The same public, showy, self-righteous style of prayer Jesus condemns in the Pharisee is, in this warning, directly tied to real exploitation. Long, impressive-sounding prayers were being used as cover, while vulnerable widows were being taken advantage of financially. The comparison prayer, the resume prayer, wasn't just spiritually empty. In its worst form, it was a disguise for actual harm. And right after that exact warning about scribes and widows, Jesus sits down across from the temple treasury and watches people put in their offerings. Rich people put in large amounts. Then a poor widow comes and puts in 2 small copper coins, worth almost nothing. And Jesus tells his disciples that this woman has put in more than all the others because she gave out of her poverty everything she had to live on. Put those two scenes side by side. In one, religious men make long, impressive prayers while quietly taking from widows. In the other, a widow gives everything she has without a single recorded word of prayer at all, and Jesus holds her up as the example. The contrast couldn't be sharper. Impressive sounding devotion versus quiet, costly, unnoticed devotion. And Jesus consistently sides with the second. This is where the open loop from the very beginning finally closes. Remember the question, why did Jesus clear away 3 specific habits before giving the Lord's Prayer at all? Because all 3 of them, performing for an audience, babbling for volume, and comparing yourself favorably to someone else, share the exact same root underneath. Every one of them centers the person praying instead of the God being prayed to. And the Lord's Prayer is built almost point for point as the opposite of all 3. It isn't prayed for an audience. It starts private, addressed to our Father, not staged for onlookers. It isn't padded with empty repetition. Every line is short and does something specific. And it isn't a resume of comparison. It says, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, placing the one praying in the same position as everyone else who needs mercy, not above them. There's one more honest voice worth hearing here, because it shows what the alternative sounds like when it's not perfectly composed either. Long before Jesus, David, a king, a warrior, a deeply flawed man, wrote prayers that are raw, almost to the point of discomfort. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? That's not performance. That's not a formula. That's not a comparison to anyone else in the room. It's a king alone telling God exactly how abandoned he feels. It's messy and unresolved in the moment he writes it, and scripture keeps it anyway, because that kind of honesty was never the problem Jesus was naming. Only its counterfeit was. Maybe you recognize a smaller version of this tension in your own life. Think about the difference between saying, I'm fine, because you actually mean it, and saying it on total autopilot because it's simply expected. Or think about a public apology crafted more for the people watching than for the one person who was actually owed it. Technically, the right words, aimed at the wrong audience the entire time. That's exactly the gap Jesus is naming in every one of these 3 habits. Not wrong words, wrong audience, wrong center. So here's what all of this leaves you with. First, the truth of it. Jesus didn't name vague spiritual flaws. He named 3 specific habits: praying to be seen, praying with empty repetition, and praying in self-righteous comparison to someone else, and called every one of them vain, worthless, and hypocritical in his own words. Second, what that means for you. For every single habit he condemned, he didn't just leave a rebuke hanging in the air. He gave a concrete, specific alternative in the very next breath. The inner room instead of the street corner. The short, honest prayer instead of the babbled formula. The tax collector's 6 words instead of the Pharisee's resume. And third, the part that should stay with you longest. The Lord's Prayer isn't simply a prayer Jesus happened to teach. It's the structural opposite of everything he just finished condemning. Private instead of performed, brief instead of babbling, humble instead of comparing. Which means the most famous prayer in history was never separate from this warning. It was the direct answer to it. Which of these three habits did you recognize yourself in while watching this? Praying to be seen, repeating empty words, or comparing yourself to someone else in the very prayer you're praying? Tell me below, because naming it honestly is exactly the alternative Jesus was asking for. Because in the end, Jesus never asked you for a longer prayer, or a more impressive one, or one performed for anyone at all. He asked for one prayed behind a shut door, to a Father who already sees, and already knows, and is already listening.